Welcome back, my friends, to another action-packed adventure in switching on the Western Kansas Rail's N-scale layout known as the WKR. The crew of train 5732 West is going to leave the siding and head to the General Mills plant to pick up 2 loaded PD hoppers and dropping off 2 loaded grain hoppers. In 1922, the General Mills plant was built in Kansas City, Missouri. 100 years later, in 2022, General Mills is one of the largest flour mills in North America. The plant produces over 2.7 million pounds of flour a day, as well as dry baking products. General Mills produces a variety of breakfast cereals. So what's the difference between a grain mill and a grain elevator? A grain elevator is much taller silos as the grain is expected to be stored relatively long term. It's designed to dry and process the grain and keep it in storage. The grain mill, as you can see in this picture, has multiple smaller silos. And that's because those are just temporary storage. They want to have enough grain on hand on a daily basis to keep the mill in operation. So what grains are commonly used? Grains include wheat, rye, barley, and oats, along with buckwheat, millet, and corn, which is one reason why they have so many smaller silos, because they have to keep the different grains separate. So, how does a grain mill turn grain into flour? Well, funny you should ask. The mill cleans the grain. They remove any foreign objects like stones, husks, or weed seeds from the grain. Then they set up the mill by turning the mill on and setting the desired coarseness. This will vary depending on the grain used and the desired product. Then they grind the grain. They pour the cleaned grain into the hopper of the mill and start the grind. Then they sift the flour. Once the grain has been ground, they sift out any coarse meal. You can collect the fine flour and then regrind any larger pieces that were separated out. And then you repeat as necessary. For a finer flour, you repeat the grinding and the sifting process until you reach the desired consistency. This side of the elevator is the processing side where they do all that grinding. This is a Google Earth shot of the actual plant in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, one of the differences between my model is this area here, where it is way too long. It's much longer than what I modeled, and just out of space for compression, I had to shorten this up quite a bit. This is the grain. Now, this is actually a horseshoe-shaped area with a train car loading on the inside. But this is the grain silos, and this is the grain processing side over here. Now, I don't know for sure, I have no idea, but I'm making the assumption that this long, low area in which you have truck loading off to the one end, I'm assuming that that's where your product is bagged, wrapped on pallets, and then loaded onto trucks for transportation. Now, you see down here, they have this massive rail yard, and these are all box cars. Well, this is where they also ship the bagged product much longer distances. On the other side is where they load the pressure differential hopper cars with just the raw flour. This is a look at the back side of the mill, and you can see on the siding for the mill, the 2 pressure differential hopper cars that are loaded are up closest to us, and the 2 empty grain cars are farthest from us. Plus, the grain cars that we need to deliver are behind the locomotive, so we're going to use this long passing siding to do a runaround movement. We need to add the grain cars to the 2 that are already there, but swapping them so that the empties are on the outside, and then pick up the pressure differential cars and add them to our train. The crew just received their clearance, so let's go.